The U.S. Constitution has a special place in the hearts and minds of many Americans, and is even revered by some as a sacred document. After all, in it is outlined the government of the United States, a government that, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, is to be a government of the people, by the people, for the people. But the Constitution was not always looked upon so favorably, especially in the early years of our country. Its beginnings were steeped in controversy. The Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia was hardly peaceful and at many times almost collapsed. Some simply wanted to make small changes to the existing governing document of the day, the Articles of Confederation. They opposed efforts to deviate significantly from its provisions. Others felt that the Articles of Confederation were too weak to be salvaged and pushed for a new governing document altogether. Ultimately, the latter sentiment prevailed, and it took from May until September of 1787 to construct the Constitution. As challenging as it had been to put together the document during the summer months of 1787, it wasn't until after it had been finished that the real work began. Ratification. Those who supported ratification were called the Federalists, and those who opposed, the Anti-Federalists. Well, one of the chief sticking points during the ratification debates, which moved from state to state as each state had its own convention to debate the merits of the proposed Constitution, was its lack of a Bill of Rights. In fact, a Bill of Rights had been proposed at the very end of the Constitutional Convention. George Mason had moved that one be added to the Constitution as a preface, signifying the importance of individual rights. Mason looked to the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which he's credited for writing, as a model and maintained that details could be worked out in just a few hours. But after the grueling summer months of the back and forth of the convention, there simply wasn't the support to spend the time on working out such a Bill of Rights, which many believed would take longer than just a few hours. As a result, Mason refused to sign the Constitution, and the debate over the addition of the Bill of Rights would spill over into the ratification debates. The Anti-Federalists supported the concept of a Bill of Rights as a way to place specific limits on the power of the government and to protect individual liberty. Federalists disputed the need for a Bill of Rights, claiming it was unnecessary since the Constitution had simply granted limited powers to the federal government, with all remaining powers resting with the states and the people. While some states ratified the Constitution quickly, things started to get bogged down, especially when it came to the larger states of the day, like Virginia, home to George Mason, and James Madison, who's considered the father of the Constitution. The ratification of the Constitution was in jeopardy. It wasn't until some Federalists began to consent to supporting the adoption of a Bill of Rights, which would be done as the first act of the newly created Congress, that opposition to the Constitution began to subside, at least to the point where the conventions of all 13 states ended up ratifying the document, though some were very close votes. One of those who at first opposed the inclusion of a Bill of Rights, but later changed his mind, was James Madison, the father of the Constitution. He agreed to support the inclusion of a Bill of Rights during his campaign for the House of Representatives. Once elected, Madison lived up to his promise. He gathered the various suggestions that had been put forward by the states during the ratification debates and went through the Constitution line by line, intending for the changes to be written into the Constitution itself. However, a number of folks objected to the idea of inserting the amendments into the Constitution because they maintained that Congress did not have the authority to change the Constitution's wording. Instead, the changes were to be added as a list of amendments at the end of the Constitution, such that the original wording of the Constitution would always be intact. After sifting through the various proposals, the House came up with 17 proposed amendments, which the Senate subsequently narrowed to 12. Then these 12 proposed amendments were sent to the states for ratification. 10 of the 12 were ratified as what we know today as the Bill of Rights. 2 were not, though one of the 2 would ultimately be ratified many years later as the 27th Amendment. Ironically, Virginia, home to George Mason, who had proposed the Bill of Rights in the first place, and home to James Madison, who subsequently helped push it through, was the last state to ratify the Bill of Rights. But in the end, had it not been for the agreement to adopt the Bill of Rights, the Constitution may never have been ratified. And had it not been for the controversy surrounding the adoption of the Constitution itself, we may not have even had a Bill of Rights.